For the sake of our guests, let me explain where you find us as a church. We are on the tail end of something that we do every year called the Jesus season. We do it between Christmas, the beginning of Jesus' life, and the end of it, which is his death and resurrection. And this week, as I'm sure you're aware, we start something that Christians worldwide will celebrate along with us. In fact, there are very few times you and I gather as a church family here on Sunday morning in the Homeschool building in far south Wyoming when you know you are doing something that the rest of the globe who shares your faith is doing this very morning too. This is called Palm Sunday, the beginning of something that we call Holy Week or Jesus Passion Week. It will end with Jesus' death on Good Friday and his resurrection on Easter or Resurrection Sunday next week. And as I'm sure you're aware, especially those of you who have been around the church block, Holy Week in most churches starts with a discussion of something called Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, what that video that you just saw is about. When he started that week by entering Jerusalem to argue with the Jewish leaders, to appeal to the people, and ultimately to be betrayed by Judas and crucified. Well, little known is this fact. There is actually another event in your Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as told by three of them. So the only one who doesn't tell of this event is Luke. That precedes or begins what we call Holy Week. You know what it is? It's actually what we want to talk about today. It's an event that happens before Jesus enters Jerusalem in what we know as the triumphal entry. It is a far more intimate or personal story than that. It is a family story. It is a story of relationships. It is a beautiful story. It is the story of Jesus having dinner in a little town named Bethany. And we are going to talk about this story from the gospel that you are reading this year, the Gospel of Matthew, as he tells it to us. We are told in Matthew chapter 26, beginning in verse 6, that before Jesus entered Jerusalem, before all the events of Holy Week, now Jesus was at Bethany. Bethany is just a few miles east of Jerusalem. It is on the main road between Jericho and Jerusalem. It's not hard to get from Bethany to Jerusalem in just a matter of minutes, maybe an hour or two by foot. Jesus has spent a lot of time in Bethany, by the way, and we'll talk more about that. Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper. John's version of this story in John chapter 12 tells you that it's Lazarus' house. Why the difference? Because they're related. We know that Lazarus had two sisters, one of whom is in this story, named Mary. The other is named Martha. We don't know how Simon was related to Lazarus. Given that the house is called Simon's house, here's the best bet. Simon is the oldest brother in the family, Simon is the father of the family, or Simon is the uncle of the family. But it's his house. And Jesus is at Bethany for dinner with his family and his followers before the tumultuous last week of his life. And a woman related to Simon, sister to Martha and Lazarus, we know from John's account, named Mary, came to him during dinner with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment. And she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. Most biblical scholars will tell you that this is something called nard, N-A-R-D. It is a perfumed oil, and it is quite costly. It is estimated that the perfume used here was worth about 600 denarii, which is 600 days' wages. At the federal minimum wage, this is $35,000 in your money and my money. This is not as big as some of the sums we were talking about last Sunday in the story of the silver talents, but it's not nothing. And more to the point, 95% or more of the families in Israel in the time of Jesus would have been classified as working poor or completely poor. For that kind of family, 35 grand is a lot of money, just like it is for most of us in the room. It is also very likely that for Mary, this was what's called her dowry. In Jesus' culture, if you were a woman and you were of marrying age, then your family would work out what is in effect a legal or fiscal contract with somebody else's family, and the groom would purchase you, or more often than not, your family would give the groom's family a sum of money called a dowry so that the wedding would happen. She effectively, by doing this act, is giving away her one best shot at ever getting married. She is signing herself up to be single for the rest of her life in her culture by this act. Don't miss that. This is huge. And her pouring this expensive perfumed oil over Jesus' head and on his feet was really an act in that culture that was only reserved for either royalty, civic leaders, or esteemed guests. Very important people, VIPs. You didn't do this for everybody. You can imagine, by the way, the smell. If you're a fan of Middle Eastern food like my family and I are, you can imagine that smell, and then you toss in now the very pungent, beautiful smell of, say, lavender. You can smell what it would be like, and even how pleasurable it would be to all the guests around the table. Then what happens, we are told, in both Matthew's version and John's version in John 12, is that the disciples don't like this act because what she did was expensive, and they think it's better that she should have sold that perfume and give it to the poor. John tells us in John chapter 12 that the ringleader of this revolt against Mary's act was Judas Iscariot. And the reason that he did it is because he wanted to steal the money for himself. His idea here may have sounded noble, but his purpose was not. He was not going to give it to the poor at all. He was going to try to siphon some off for himself. And we are told at the end of this retelling of dinner at Simon's house in Bethany, Jesus speaking, that by pouring this ointment on my body right now, she has prepared me for burial. We have talked previously, as we've journeyed through Matthew together, that Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen to him when he went to Jerusalem that one last time. He knew he was going there to die. He knew he was going there to openly confront the Jewish leaders and the powers that be, to throw himself entirely against the system of religion that they had built, and he knew them well enough to know they were going to kill him for it. So he says this act that Mary performed in Bethany was like you would do to a body that you were preparing for burial in his day and time. You would put perfumed oil all over and even inside that body to make it smell good for the first few days that it spent in the tomb. Did Mary understand what she was doing? Did she know that Jesus was preparing to go to Jerusalem and die? We don't know. But Jesus knew that what Mary was doing was like what would happen to his body less than 7 days later after he died and was put in a tomb. And Jesus finishes by saying, hey, you know what? This woman, Mary of Bethany, is going to be someone that for all of what you and I call church history, the history of the Christian faith, she will be remembered for what she has done here. There's an irony here. The Mary that most people remember from the Bible is who? Mary, the mother of Jesus. Guess what? Jesus said to Mary, at least one of them that we ought to remember the same way we do with the fondness of the mother of Jesus, is Mary of Bethany, for what she did here. Now, as I mentioned to you, this is a family story. This is the story about relationships among this family and their relationship with Jesus. We know about this family just about more than we do any other characters in the Gospels in your Bible. Probably the only other characters that we know more about are Simon Peter in Jesus' own family from the Christmas stories. Nobody else. Maybe John the Baptist too. You have two sisters, Mary and Martha. They are famously described in a short little passage at the end of Luke chapter 10. These passages that I'm about to mention, by the way, you can read this week if you want. They're listed in your leaflet right there under the Jesus season reading for the week. You have two sisters. You have their brother Lazarus, who becomes very famous in the Gospel of John in John chapter 11. We'll reference that a little later in a moment. And then we have Simon, who is related to them, but we don't know how. What do you hear in this story about dinner at Simon's house that is instructive about your own relationship with Jesus, but also your families? Because this is a story of family. Now, if you're not married and you don't have kids, you still have family, by the way. You have your dear friends who are your traveling companions. You have your parents, perhaps, if you're young enough. You have your significant other. When you hear me say family, you think of those people. Hopefully you think of some of the people here who are part of your church family and are knit closely together with you. I want to focus first on this character in the story, the one we know the least about, but just by the description of him, we can actually say a lot. Not Lazarus, not Mary, not Martha. Let's talk about Simon for a minute. This is how the story opens in Matthew chapter 26. Jesus is in Bethany preparing for the last week of his life, which will surely be the most taxing and stressful upon him. And we are told that he was having dinner with his followers and his dear friends at Simon the leper's house. Here's what we know from that phrase alone. Simon was a leper at some point. He had leprosy, and he didn't anymore. You know why we know he didn't have it anymore? Because he had a house. Let me describe for you the cost of leprosy upon a person in Jesus' day and time. Let me describe to you what happened to the family of Mary, Martha, Simon, and Lazarus at some point during their lifetime. So here's this beloved person, part of the biological family of Mary and Martha, named Simon. Maybe their dad. Maybe their older brother. Maybe their beloved uncle. And they are a tightly knit family, a family of faith. They love one another, they care for one another, and lo and behold, at some point, we don't know when, Simon notices that his skin on his hand is beginning to change and turn gray, become ulcerous. At that moment in Simon's life, within days, if not hours, his entire life and the entire life of his family is turned upside down. The minute that it becomes publicly known that he has leprosy, he has to leave everything. His job, his friends, his town, everything. And he has to go live out in the sticks, out in the farmland, in a tent town with only people like himself who have contracted deadly diseases doomed to die, for which there is no known cure. Within hours, if not days, Mary and Martha and Lazarus lost Simon. Can you imagine what that last day in the house was like? There they are, gathered together as a family, and they watch Simon, with a bundle over his back, stuffed full of all the possessions that he can fill it with, walk out their door for the last time, knowing that he will never return. And yet at some point in Jesus' 3 to 3.5 years of public ministry and life, he ran across Simon, the leper. We don't know when. What we do know is what happened. Jesus healed Simon, the leper, and he got to go home. He got to go home. I want you to imagine what that was like. Here's Mary and Martha and Lazarus, this tightly knit family. They get their dad back. They get their brother back. They get their uncle back. You want to bet that was a big party? Jesus had dinner in Bethany in Simon the leper's house, whom he had healed, whom he had brought back from the dead, and gave him back to his family. Here's the thing. All of us who are Christians, we have stories like that. All of us who are privileged enough to be a part of family units, whether it's friends or real biological family where we share faith in Jesus, we have stories like that. And you should remember your stories of divine intervention. This family would never forget it, what Jesus did for Simon. To their dying day, this was a story they would tell over and over. They would never tire of it. What's your family story of when you knew that God did for you what no one else could do? How did he intervene for you in a way that no one else could? How did he turn death into life? How did he change evil into great good? The stories are there. Are you paying attention? Are you holding on to them? Do you share them together? Do you retell them together? This is the fabric of your life. So much of faith is remembering. Sometimes in our life, as we'll talk about momentarily, your present circumstances work against your faith, and the only thing you have to lean on is the past. Will you remember together? Now here's the irony of this family, just like yours and mine. Oh, I forgot to put that up there. Sorry. There you go. Here's what happened to this family after Simon the leper was healed. We hear in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, that their brother, Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus, has gotten sick. And they appeal to Jesus to come and heal Lazarus the way that he already had done Simon. And Jesus delays for reasons he and only he are sure about, we are told in John 11. And by the time he arrives in Bethany, whatever the disease or illness is that Lazarus had killed him. He was already dead. And so Mary and Martha greet Jesus when he arrives, and they say to him, "It is too bad that you got here so late. If you had only gotten here a little earlier, you could have healed Lazarus and given him back to us the way you already did with Simon. But now that he's dead, there's nothing you can do about it. He's gone. He is long gone from us. He is beyond your ability to help." And the Gospel of John, chapter 11, tells us they underestimated how far Jesus' reach can go, because Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. This is a very interesting and telling insight into how faith works in your family, among your friends, even in the life of the church, and surely in our own lives individually. You would think that if you had someone in your life that God brought back from a terminal illness, like leprosy in the case of Simon, that you would never doubt God's ability to intervene again. In fact, I'm pretty sure that most of us think that. You know what? If God got me another job to provide for my family when my job was disappearing and my ability to care for my family was dissipating, I am never going to forget that. So we think. And yet only a year, maybe 2, maybe 3, after Jesus heals Simon from leprosy and brings him back to his family, Lazarus falls ill. And Jesus delays, so not only does he fall ill, but the illness claims his life. And at that point, Mary and Martha, and yes, even Simon, who had been healed from leprosy, threw their hands up in the air and said, "Well, God can't do this." However big it was in the past that God intervened for us, he cannot take care of what we're dealing with presently. It is just too big. God can heal the sick. He can't raise the dead. So they thought. You need to remember that about your family and your friends. Oftentimes the size of the present trouble convince us that God cannot do for us now what he did in the past. Or we think that what we're dealing with right now is so big compared to what God has done for us supernaturally in the past, that yes, all of that is awesome. Those are pleasant memories, but surely he cannot do for us what we need now. And at that point, we become just like this dear family, as recorded in the Gospels. The problem for us is not that God's ability is too small, it's that our memory is too short. And because our memory is too short, therefore we limit what we think God can do. Just like this family did. This is why it's so important, by the way, that you never forget those stories in the past that you and your friends share, you and your family share about what God has done for you, how he has intervened for you when nobody else could and nothing else would work. It's the only way that you're going to remember. When the chips are down, at the present moment, when it seems like you are overwhelmed, that God can and will do it again. The past for you is the only protector of your faith in the present. This is what we see in this great family in the Gospels in your Bible. I want you to switch now and think about what you see in the person of Mary. Jesus says, famous Mary. Mary whose name should ring out throughout the centuries of church history. A figure and a name that he would advise us we should never forget. Mary of Bethany. You saw Mary do something in the story that would have seemed on the surface to be outlandish. It would have seemed to be excessive to you if you and I had been there. It would have even seemed risky to you, quite frankly, if you and I were there. Here's a woman who is giving away, very likely, the most precious thing she has in her life to honor Jesus. $35,000 worth of a precious ointment that very likely was her only way into marriage and security as a woman in that day and time. And she was willing to risk that, to give it all away to Jesus, just to honor him that night. Why did she do it? Doesn't say. We can guess, though. The first time you encounter this Mary is in the Gospel of Luke, the last half of Luke chapter 7. And in that story, you are not told her name. But we learn her name in John's account of this dinner at Bethany in John 12. All we know about her in the second half of Luke chapter 7 is that she is called, in Luke's words, a notorious sinner. She is someone who has got it so wrong, who has messed things up so bad that everybody in town knows it. All her friends, all her friends' friends, all her friends' friends' friends know that she's a screw-up. She has blown her life. She is a notorious sinner. We don't know what the sin is. We just knew it's that bad. And she approaches Jesus, who is having dinner at a Jewish leader's house in Bethany. And Jesus, in the course of that story, forgives her. He says, I want you to go in peace and sin no more. Changed her life. Radically, instantly transformed her life because he'd offered her divine forgiveness and a new route forward. Maybe she remembered that night in Bethany. This is the man who changed me like nobody else. This is the man through whom God has changed my life. He's given me my life back. He's given me a life I'd never dreamed of. He's released me from the sins that plagued me. And so that night, she honored Jesus excessively. Maybe Maybe she remembered how Jesus was the person through whom God gave her not just Simon back, but Lazarus back, both from the dead in their own way. And she said, this man is worth the best thing I have. I am going to honor him like royalty in front of all these guests, all these followers. Maybe she knew what was coming for Jesus, just like he did, and that his life was going to be very short henceforth. And she respected this man more than anybody else because he, like none other, was going to march into Jerusalem and point the way to something different, something better, God's way, and he was willing for it to cost his life. And so she honored Jesus. What you need to know is that sometimes in your life, you are going to be moved by God's Spirit to honor Jesus or sacrifice for Jesus or take a risk for Jesus that doesn't make sense to other people. Surely, like that act, did not make sense that night to all gathered there. Moreover, there are going to be people in your family, among your friends, among your church family, among your biological family, if you share faith in Jesus, who are going to be moved to take risks, act excessively, or act sacrificially, and it's not going to make sense to you. Don't be surprised when it happens. Sometimes Jesus grips us so, sometimes we are moved by God's Spirit to honor him or give to him in a way that to other people in that moment seems risky, seems weird, it even seems wrong. I'm telling you the example of famous Mary, Mary of Bethany, is that you should know in those moments. In fact, maybe you should expect that all of us will have moments like that. And you need to respond in faith, like she did. Take the risk. Give more than seems appropriate. Sacrifice more than others think prudent. Be excessive in how you honor Jesus in your life, in how you give yourself away to his work and his people. And here's maybe the most important thing you need to know about this entire family. Certainly you need to know about Mary and her relationship with Jesus. All of this, everything I have said so far about Jesus and his relationship with this family of at least 4 people, called Mary, Martha, Simon, and Lazarus, is built upon lots of time together. Here's the coolest thing. This is a family, I hope you can tell, that is just enrapturing the more you learn about them. Here's the coolest thing I can tell you about them. This was Jesus' safe haven. Jesus said about himself in the Gospels that he had no place to call home. He was a vagabond, a nomad, a wanderer. Sometimes he would stay in Peter's mother-in-law's house, but we all know how mothers-in-laws are, and that probably wasn't all that pleasant sometimes, right? Here's the other place that Jesus would call home, his home base, his safe haven, Mary and Martha's house. Whenever Jesus was in the southern part of Israel around Jerusalem, which was at least half of his work, we know where he stayed. He stayed with them. He stayed with the leper that he cured. He stayed with Lazarus, who would grow ill and die and be raised from the dead. He stayed with Mary. He stayed with Martha. There were hours invested in this relationship that you and I have a window into in Matthew 26 and this dinner at Simon's house. In fact, there's a little story, a tender story, a gorgeous story, told at the end of Luke chapter 10 about these 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, where Jesus shows up to relax and decompress at their house from the rigors of doing ministry. And Martha wants to be a good hostess. So she's running around the house, preparing what she can, cleaning up, making dinner, all that stuff. And Mary, famous Mary, timeless Mary of Bethany, chooses to forego all the formalities of being a good hostess, and she just sits with Jesus. She just sits and listens. She sits and talks. She soaks in everything that he says. She asks all her questions. She just loves being around him. There is no one in the Gospels more devoted to Jesus than Mary of Bethany. That's what we know. What would it be like for your family and for mine to be a safe haven for Jesus? Here's how we often think about Jesus. We think about things that we need to do for Jesus. So we as a family, my family included, will talk about the things that we want to be accomplishing for Jesus and his kingdom. What kind of work do we want to be doing? Where do we want to direct our time and energy? These are not bad things to talk about, by the way. The other way that we think about our relationship with Jesus, if we're among our family or among our friends or church family, is what we can get from Jesus. What we need Jesus to do for us. Well, his relationship with Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and Simon was neither of those. Sure, Jesus did big things in their lives. He cured leprosy. He raised someone from the dead. This is not why Jesus loved them so much. This did not define their relationship. Jesus was able to go to their house and relax. Jesus was able to go to their house and not have to worry about all the pressures that he faced week in and week out, month in and month out, as the throngs wanted him to minister to them. What would it be like for you to give the Spirit of Jesus a place in your home and your family that brought him peace and him rest, not just you? What if all it was in your family was you being like Mary and just spending time enjoying his company and letting him enjoy yours? You understand that's half of what the spiritual life is about? It is not just you enjoying the presence of the Spirit of Jesus and learning from him. Half of it is God wants to enjoy you. He likes to hear you pray. He likes it when you turn your attention on him. He likes it when he can speak his direct, gentle truth into your life. He likes that. It's why he made you in the first place. What if you could cultivate a family where God could do that? Where you could enjoy him, but he could enjoy you. He could hear you laugh. He could hear you pray together. He could hear you talk together about his son and how his son is shaping you into a better and better follower of his. What if you were a safe haven for Jesus? This takes time. It will not happen if you are not consciously devoting time to it. How can you help each other, your friends, your church family, your biological family, kick off their shoes, put up their heels, and just enjoy time with Jesus? What does that look like for your wife, your son? How can you help them do that? How can they help you do that? This is what we learn from this extraordinary family in Bethany. It is no surprise to me, frankly, that in the last quiet time of his life, before the week that we know as Holy Week, that would be hard, difficult, stressful, in which he would be pulled in so many directions, in which he would be tried, in which he would be crucified. It is no surprise to me that his last moment of rest and recreation was that he visited his friends in Bethany. What'd you hear today? What can you take with you today about your own faith, your own spiritual life, and or the spiritual life that you share with your family, your friends, those who are your spiritual traveling companions? This is what you hear. This is what you see in the family of Mary, Martha, Simon, and Lazarus. What are your spiritual stories? Your divine interventions. And more to the point, how are you going to remember them, because it is in remembering them that you preserve and protect your faith in the present. Don't you want to be a family like they were? Don't you want to be a place where Jesus feels at home? He feels comfortable. He feels at peace. How will you help those that you are closest to accomplish that in their lives? If it happens to be your spouse and your kids, how will you accomplish that in your home? What will you do to be a safe haven for Jesus? Would you take a minute here at the end of the message, and I want to give you an opportunity to just reflect for a moment and allow God's voice to speak to you. And what you heard today that you need to keep and use. After I give you a moment to listen to God's Spirit, I will pray for us all.